This
subsection
conference
about,
will now be recorded.
thank you, about housing strategies for an aging population is to talk about possibly increasing age-attractive housing options. And this can include a couple of different types, which are discussed in here. Just the basic, what we call in Stratford, residence apartment regulations. We have a provision for age-restricted housing. We have a section on affordable housing. We have the TOD overlay. We also allow for housing options in the waterfront district, and we might choose to change or modify any one of those. And we also have in section 1.2.2 the concept about facilitating congregate assisted living and nursing home situations in town. We have some facilities in Stratford today. The demand or need for these may increase in the future. And we should just talk about whether or not we feel our zoning regulations are appropriate for that. And then the third major part of housing strategies for an aging population is increasing housing options for low-income seniors. This is where we start to get into the housing authority because they are the ones that are the leaders in terms of addressing housing needs for lower income seniors and their situation and opportunities that may exist there. Whether or not there are opportunities to encourage other types of elderly housing developments. Some communities have nonprofit groups which have stepped up to address this type of situation. Whether or not there's an opportunity in Stratford to encourage that type of scenario. And the third option here could be repurposing existing homes occupied by elderly people. Some people are house rich but cash poor. And there might be opportunities to use existing housing units to address some types of housing situations. So I think that's enough of a menu, if you will, for today. We only really have an hour, and then we'll kick into the other major strategies later. So I think in terms of a detailed conversation, if we go back to page 8, the strategy here is, again, the state's passed legislation that enables what they call granny pods, or temporary health care units, to be placed in people's backyards on a temporary basis. The statute contains a number of provisions that limit how this can be applied and require that it be for medical purposes that have to be documented by a doctor, et cetera, and the unit has to be removed at the end. So this is allowed in Stratford, but most people may not know about it. So the only real strategy option here, I think, if the committee was interested, is to put a provision in the zoning regulations that indicates that it is permitted in Stratford in accordance with the statute. Any thoughts or questions on this strategy?
I can comment as part of planning that we felt affirmative with this policy. It did not need a vote because it essentially is state law. So I think putting it into our zoning would make a lot of sense so that there's more clarity in what we're doing.
This is Laura. Go ahead, Carol.
I'm sorry, that was it.
So in any kind of operations I've worked with, whenever it was state law, there was never a need to duplicate it and make it part of our law because it's already state statute. We have to comply with it. If we were to change it, and my question would be, in order to make this a real viable situation, why does it have to be medically restricted? And the irony to me is a medically restricted use that is not attached or contiguous to the dwelling, it doesn't really make sense to me. So I just am curious from the Planning and Zoning Commission why it was allowed this way.
I think that we essentially became affirmative because we didn't have the time in order to discuss this properly. So what you're bringing up is exactly what we had discussed, but we did not have the time to rewrite our own specific regulations. So we had to go with the state. But if I remember correctly, the state allows for variance in this as long as the broad letter of the law is followed, so that we could customize it for Stratford.
I think my read probably, Harold and Laura, is there's probably two flavors here. One of which is that the state statute as written provides an overrule of local zoning subject to the town's approval. And that if you decided to do something unique to Stratford, you would be going outside of that enabling legislation under the general rule of zoning. And that would in fact be site specific. So we could modify it. We could opt out of the state program and adopt our own if we wanted to, or we could just, as the town has already done, stay consistent with the state program. Laura, last time we also talked about the concept of affordable accessory apartments. And the committee was kind of split, if you will, as to whether or not our current regulations were appropriate or whether or not we should look at some flexibility in that area. And I've got extensive notes based on our conversation last time about basic accessory apartments. And these temporary granny pods would be in addition to what we decide to do on that issue.
Okay, thank you.
So my notes at this point in time is to continue with opting in or not opting out, I guess. I had two thoughts on whether or not we should incorporate this in the zoning regs, just so people are aware of it. Otherwise, they may never know that this is an option available to them. Any consensus on the committee on this one?
I don't actually think zoning regs are a good way of communicating to the general public. So there are other ways
Beth,
of
I agree.
communications. Zoning
Right.
regulations. People aren't going to turn to zoning regulations for that.
If this is a program that we want to promote, you're exactly right. Whether it's in the zoning regulations or not is relevant because it's in statute, and the town accepted it. So if we're going to leave it the same, then nothing has to be done by zoning. And I think that we could promote the program ourselves.
So I think that's what I'll do here is I'll modify this one if we decide to continue, is that our basic strategy here is promote education so that people are aware of this and then move on. Is that fair?
That's fair. Can I just ask about this? Does it have to be? Yes. Can I just ask, does this need to be, this can't be contiguous to the home already? Does it always have to be a non-contiguous dwelling?
Yes. The law is written as it has to be non-contiguous. Has to be a unit that can be brought onto the property and taken off the property. That's what makes it a temporary dwelling.
Go ahead, Smith.
Amita?
Yes, I just think that this could be written in a way that health department is brought into it, like promote education through health department, so that they keep in touch with nonprofits and people who need care, and they are made aware of these options.
Yep.
Regarding this being detached as opposed to attached, I'm still not clear why we should have a detached unit, especially when the person is taking care, and would that have its own restroom and everything in it, like a kitchen and everything?
Yes.
The statutes are pretty specific on that, Smith. So the issue is it's generally a self-contained dwelling unit, kitchen, bathroom, everything else. It has to be hooked up to water supply and sewage, which is not an inexpensive situation. But it could be for a caregiver. So if somebody needs around-the-clock nursing care, they might sleep in the unit, or a team might sleep in the unit, and then with an alarm or something like that. So the statute's pretty specific. I don't think we need to.
It can be attached to the existing water and sewage of that dwelling.
Yes.
So that makes it a lot less expensive. The
Yep.
purpose was to get a unit in there quickly, affordably, that could also be taken out quickly at the end.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready
Going
to
back
move on.
to the
Oh, go ahead.
No, going back to the previous option, I think those of us who were opposed to it were very much opposed to the idea of having secondary dwelling units because somebody wants to increase their income. But if it were for me personally, I think if it's for a caregiver or care receiver during a documented health related situation, I would be absolutely fine with allowing that within the primary home and allowing part of the home being used for that purpose during that temporary time. We were
Good.
afraid, the discussion last time, we were afraid that the 1.1.4 was a way of getting around, getting around multifamily units. And whereas 1.1.5, the intention is to provide people with health needs better access to caregivers. And I think there's an opportunity to combine those two, but restrict it so you have the purpose of increasing access for the elderly or disabled population.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
So Glenn, if I could just interject. So to me, it's too restrictive. It should, in my opinion, if you want to share a dwelling or have a parent live on your house because they're downsizing, it shouldn't be because they need medical help from you. Or if you wanted another family member to live in a small unit on your house, for providing, I think, to provide either services or just live there temporarily. I think this is the phenomenon we're seeing now. People are selling their homes and they want something more affordable, smaller, less care, and there is no inventory. And so they're either moving out of town, moving out of state, wherever they can. And if I always go back into the deed restricted of affordable, if the income level fits, and it can be deed restricted for how many years is it supposed to be? 20 years?
I think
10
well, yeah,
years?
the state will count accessory apartments differently than they would a normal unit. So keep going.
I just think this is an opportunity to fill two voids that we have right here. One is affordable housing, and two is ancillary housing for family members.
Yeah, so I think the conversation last time on accessory apartments kind of covers this. Our current regulations today in Stratford on accessory apartments say you can't have it for a family member, or if it's not for a family member, it has to be restricted as affordable. So the challenge with that is always the enforcement of it, but we already permit, I think, the scenario which you've just described. So I think that may address that issue, Laura. Is that okay?
If you want to talk about promotion, something out of zoning regs, I mean, that's something that should be marketed if that's the case.
Okay. Anything else? Are we ready to go to 1.1.6, page 9?
No. I'm afraid I don't understand. So if my neighbor wants to have an apartment, so it would just be for a family member. If they wanted to change their house into a multifamily unit, they're allowed to for a family member?
Well, it's really not a multifamily unit, Beth. It's an accessory apartment.
Well,
So it's got,
it's an access, okay.
well,
But it has a
there's,
bathroom, it has a kitchen.
yep. So the restrictions on page 7, it's got the restrictions here about 800 square feet or 25% of the floor area.
That sounds
It's,
like an
sounds like a what?
I'm sorry, this connection's terrible
That's okay, Beth.
today.
When
Right,
it's
but
system-wide, I am
you're
have
still,
input audio only problems too, just so people know.
Okay.
Trying to fix it while we're
pardon
talking.
me?
Go ahead.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you, Beth. Did you have another thought?
No. And I just want to make sure that people can't turn their houses into multifamily houses, even if it's a small apartment that's a multifamily house, without, I mean, that has implications on the neighborhood.
So the rules that are in place today, though,
Mhm.
say, yes, if I live in Stratford, I have a house, I can carve out an accessory apartment by site plan approval from the zoning commission. I got to make an application to the commission. I can carve out an 800 square foot apartment, provided it doesn't exceed 25% of the floor area, for a family member. And commission can approve it. If it's not for a family member, then it has to be restricted as an affordable unit. So those are the two rules which are in place today. And I think the sense I have overall from our conversation last week and today is to stick with that as the town's strategy for the future.
I'm sorry, you
Fair?
cut out during the not a family member. If it's not a family member, then what?
It has to be restricted as an affordable unit.
And I
So in
thought
other
that
words,
restriction went on for 30 years.
the affordability, I'd have to go back and take another closer look, Beth, at exactly what the Stratford regulations say. I don't think the state regulations, which count affordable units, say that.
I thought last meeting you
I,
referred to
I
a
believe they
30-year
do,
restriction.
Glenn.
Go ahead, Sis Smith.
I think that's what I heard from John in our office, that it's for 30 years. I can confirm.
All right, I'll make sure that I get that, include it.
Mhm.
I think that's how Success Village went off our rolls, because it hit its 30-year limit.
Okay.
I know we aren't there yet, but at the end of the document, you mentioned challenging the way the statute is written for affordable housing. And I think that if any town has a case to do that, it would be Stratford. Because when we looked at the census data and other data, it did not look like Stratford has an affordability issue.
Now, the state, I don't think the state may change their definition. I mean, I think Milford got a change to their situation, but there's other stuff which is being percolating around for this next legislative session, Beth. So it's going to be an interesting time for sure.
Mhm.
I'm ready to move on to 1.1.6 if everybody else is. So in section
Would that be
1.1,
age restricted?
no, we're on page 9.
Right.
So the issue on here is that our current regulations have a limit of family, or definition of family, which limits housing occupancy. So technically, two unrelated people dating, living together before they get married, or just elderly people who want to share a unit, technically are zoning violators. So this has become an issue in some communities around the state. Your definition kind of stuck out as being outside of what other communities are doing. Some communities are just eliminating the phrase related by blood, marriage, or adoption, or they're adding in the phrases civil union and other types of situations. And the basic requirement is living as a single housekeeping unit. So there is no second kitchen in there. There is no other scenario. It is just people living together as a single housekeeping unit. Do we want to tackle this or let a sleeping dog lie? What's the committee's feeling on this?
The 21st century suggests that our current naming of related by blood, marriage, or adoption is not at all the current thinking. We have to rewrite this for that segment. Otherwise, Bruce and I, who lived together for 38 years, would have spent a great deal of our time being illegal.
Yep.
Which we did do in New York, and it was a burden. So I fully support that we write this in a sensible way that represents a better concept of family. People who choose to live together as a unit.
You need to be careful, though, that it doesn't open up the possibility of homes being turned into rooming houses.
So the regs actually already allow for that.
Mm-hmm.
So bear with me just for a moment here. Can't put my finger on it right away. We'll get to this later, I think, overall, Beth, but the issue is rooming houses are already permitted. Wouldn't you know, I can't put my finger on it when I need it.
It was up to two more, you can rent out rooms. The last time we spoke about this, for two people, right? But you don't want to increase the number, so you can have a rooming house. And there are some large houses in town of, 8 to 10 people. In my neighborhood, there are.
All right, so I mean, I think is the general sense here that there might be time for a change here. Again, the phraseology is obsolete for the current world, and it may enable some housing options, remove, a zoning violation situation. But I think Beth's concern is to be careful not to open up rooming houses.
I agree with that. I think it's antiquated, the definition, and should be changed.
This is Desmond. I agree as well.
Okay, I'm ready to move on. Are we ready to move on to section 1.2 now, page 10? So here, again, one of the ways I think we touched on in part of our earlier meetings is that sometimes, and Laura touched on it just in this meeting as well, people, particularly older households, may no longer need all of the bedrooms and everything else. They may be desiring some housing choices or options. And some of the age attractive housing options might provide amenities, be they, pools or common area maintenance or other types of situations like that. So increasing age attractive housing options could be addressed in a couple of different ways. Section 1.2.1 talks about the different ways that Stratford already permits non-single family housing in town. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different flavors of this. And we could choose to accentuate some over others or change or modify any or all. But part of our goal here under this scenario would be to try to increase the number of age attractive housing options for seniors. So the options which are under here right now today are current residence apartment regulations. There are some restrictions and limitations on this in terms of building height and coverage and the density that's permitted. We have, I think, Susmitha had prepared a inventory of developments around the town. I think there could be 30 individual developments in Stratford that were approved under the residence apartment regulations. There's another regulation. I'm at the top of page 12 here now for age restricted housing. This might be the Oronoque type of situation. It's limited to detached units. You can't have townhouses. It requires at least 20 acres of land, the maximum of 2 units per acre. So it's an option, maybe an intermediate step between single family and multifamily. But the 20-acre requirement would limit, there may not be too many sites in Stratford which would be eligible for this regulation at the present time. The next one is the affordable housing development regulations.
Can you tell me where are we right now?
I'm at the top of page 12. I'm just trying to give an overview, Harold, of the 5 different flavors of multifamily. So
okay, thank you.
Happy to, thank you. Bottom of page 12 is the affordable housing development regulations. This is out of sync a little bit with an 830G affordable housing appeals regulation, but it addresses the issue of housing affordability. It may have been for a particular project or situation. The units must be single family detached, no more than 4 units per building. There's some locational guidelines about proximity to fire station, sidewalks, transit routes, etc. So it may or may not be kind of addressing our needs at the present time. And the maximum density that's permitted might in fact be lower than what's permitted through the residence apartment regulations. Top of page 13, we have the TOD regulations, which are the ones which are the most recently adopted. Here we regulate in the TOD designated overlay zone the number of bedrooms that are permitted. And we may want to talk about that a little bit in terms of whether that's actually senior friendly or whether there might be other choices or options for us. And then finally, on the bottom of page 13 is the waterfront district regulations, where we allow for multifamily if there's a marine related use. So what are people's thoughts overall on these housing options and choices? Any of these seem better than another in terms of addressing senior housing needs?
So I think, I hate to be the one who's always talking, so I apologize in advance, but since there's silence, I think the more varied housing options we have, the better, because it'll stand. Right now we're looking for seniors, but we may not be. We may not, as in the future, be as focused on senior housing in the Northeast. Who knows? So I think I'm going to go back to my property management days, where mixed use was always a great option because it always kept the cash flow going, whether it was industrial, commercial, residential, retail. And so that's how I feel about our housing options. I think the key is affordability and amenity driven, depending on the segment that's looking for housing.
Just to add in, I heard you mention the bedroom. I can tell you that has been a tricky issue over the years, and perhaps not necessarily housing focused, but as we've looked at the growth of the town, there's been some concerns about having large numbers of bedrooms even in some of the bigger developments because of the potential impact to the school system and the number of children and so on. So I don't know I mean, you highlighted that, we can always talk about that, but I can just tell you that became a little bit of an issue, and it also has to do with our calculations of the neighborhoods and the number of bedroom equivalents. So that's a large, complicated number to come up with, and just even looking toward some of our calculations as far as like 830G, when they talk about housing, they don't necessarily look at that. So I don't want us to necessarily go off in a direction, but I don't know what your thoughts are. If you want to talk about that more, I'm certainly happy to.
I think it's an important consideration. I think certainly since the 1980s, the whole concept of school enrollment multipliers has changed quite dramatically. I'm not sure what the school enrollment ratio is in Stratford overall, but in most communities, there's about one school child for every 2 housing units. So the school enrollment multiplier is 0.5. And it's dropped quite significantly. So we tend to carry around the scenario that, it's leave it to Beaver and there's 2 school kids in every house. And in fact, we end up, even in studies of multifamily, have found that most families with children choose not to live in a multifamily development. And we could actually, if you thought it was helpful, collect that data for Stratford and say, of the 30 or so developments in town, what are the school enrollments from these, and see if there's any meaningful differences between them, and consider that.
And I think that would help all of our discussion in Stratford if we could actually gather that material.
Okay. I will work with Smita on making that happen.
So, Glenn, I had a question on waterfront district regulations.
Yep.
The bigger steps mentioned here is to consider allowing more density, height, and coverage. But I think it is conflicting with our coastal resiliency plan, which calls for less coverage and less density in waterfront areas because of the coastal flooding impacts moving forward and the sea level rise impacts. So how do we address this?
I think, Ms. Smither, that's a very important point. I think, one of the things I think we'll perhaps talk about when we get to the issue of the housing authority is the fact that it's very hard for us to find sites which in Stratford anywhere, never mind whether they're in the coastal resiliency area, but the issue would be that, if they're going to be flooding once every couple of years or whatever, can we build the units up so that they're above flood elevation, so no flood damage, et cetera, would occur. There might be a short-term interruption or of access or something else, but I mean, these are issues that we're going to have to try to balance. And if the idea is on the waterfront district regulations, we don't want to do that there for the coastal factors, then certainly that's a very important thing for the committee to come out and say. But that's why height was in there, Smitha, was that.
Yeah, but even if the height is elevated, some of the streets are at such low elevation themselves that the streets get flooded and you can't, you'll have to close the streets. So there'll be no access to these locations in terms of emergencies. So if somebody has a heart attack and an ambulance can't get through that street now because it's completely flooded. And we have to carefully look at the height in relation to waterfront views too, because there are some properties there that do not absolutely want to depart with those views. Now, if we raise heights everywhere, it'll be a challenge. And overall, I think we need a better strategy for this waterfront moving forward, because even if we are able to protect the properties from flooding, they're still paying a lot of insurance claims, and the community is losing out on a lot of recoveries and damages that are incurred after flooding.
So in terms of the waterfront district, Smith, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I guess I'm going to. Would you suggest we leave what we have in place, or should this provision in the regulations perhaps be eliminated because we might be putting more people in harm's way?
We have to somehow think of reconsidering a more balanced approach in locations, and I don't know how to come up with this, to be honest. We have to carefully review the coastal resiliency plan, identify the locations, and then look at this regulation and see what makes sense.
Yep.
Since we are working on, in this section, we are working on the aging population. I think it would be an overall theme that we do not want to encourage seniors to move into FEMA zones. Would make we don't want them. We don't want to encourage building of senior housing in these zones because it's a safety issue. Especially as we have more and more flooding events. In some of these areas, we have monthly flooding events. At some point, the town is going to have to be responsible for their safety. I think that we should look forward and say, let's address it now in some way. So I agree with Smitha that if anything, we should think about trimming back these regulations in this area.
Having looked at the coastal resiliency plan pretty carefully some time ago, it's not as simple as waterfront means flooding.
Well, that's why I said FEMA.
Yeah, okay, or that's fine. But I just wanted to say that you really do need to look carefully at which parts of the waterfront we're talking about. For example, most of Lordship is not in the highly vulnerable areas. So, but I want to talk about 1.2.1.2, the age restricted housing. That top section, where the zoning regs section 4.1.6.15 for the age restricted housing, to me that seems really outdated. And I just know that for example, there's a development in Westport where it looks like they took an old school and made that age restricted low income housing. It looks quite nice actually. And so it was an old school. But this idea that each unit for older people requires like a half acre, That just kind of flies in the face of it being conveniently located, and that you need the 20 acre. I think we should get rid of all of that and make it possible for there to be small apartment buildings that are age restricted.
I also think where we are missing in all of this, and actually Laura addressed this a little bit, where we're missing all of this is the fact that a lot of these seniors who essentially are wanting to downscale and stay in Stratford are living currently in single family homes. If we, and this is a very big issue, I know it's not something we're going to come up with in 2 seconds, but Livable Cities addresses the fact of taking the equivalent square footage. Let's use my neighborhood on Freeman. Let's use my house. I'm 1,700 square feet. So half of 1,700 would be what? 850 square feet. Perfect square footage for a senior dwelling. So if we could take and allow that this dwelling would be split into 2 lots or a common lot that the town would own, and these 2 houses would be sold as individual 800 to 900 square foot houses built within the scale of the existing street. So if they're all 1.5 story capes, these houses would look like a 1.5 story cape, but they would be separate. I think long term, also in terms of buildable units that we're going to have anybody interested in doing, that kind of thinking is something that I don't see it in any of this here. We're still talking about development units. We're still talking about 8 to 100 units. And that to me is not, that's addressing what the developers want to see, but it's not necessarily addressing what the needs of the seniors in town are. If we could do this, I would guarantee there would be a line of people standing in, there would be a line of people waiting to move in. It would answer so many requests that I see of people living here. Would allow them to still feel a part of the fabric of the town, still participate in their neighborhoods. If you look at what the POCD talks about my neighborhood, about areas of it needing massive redevelopment because the buildings are structurally beyond their 50, 70-year lifespan. If we're going to do that, I would rather see we do that by breaking units that fit within the texture of the neighborhood versus putting in a 12-unit apartment building, because the neighbors around it are all going to lose 10 to 20% of property value. You could build these small places that would maintain property value and actually increase the values around, because you would be accomplishing real renovations in some of these neighborhoods. So that's my take. I know that leaves you a lot, Glenn. It doesn't fit in the categories here, but it's something that if we're going to rewrite this, it's something that we really should think about as an opportunity.
So Harold, I mean, I think there is discussion within the planning profession of this type of thing. That again, the housing stock we have when zoning regulations were adopted were all predicated on sort of the baby boom era, post World War II, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue is the world has changed a lot since that time. And in many situations, we have zoned out what used to be, what is now being called as the missing middle in terms of housing. Yes. These types of situations can be created. But there's concern can be expressed about this because people don't always know where and how. So it does involve quite a bit of education. But are there places in Stratford where neighborhoods or streets or corridors or areas might be more appropriate for this and other areas where it might not be?
So Glenn, ironically, it's Laura again. When we did Zenilith proposed the center school development, yep. The part that was the most accepted was the housing units along Sutton that were 2 or 3 family units, smaller in square footage, but characteristically appropriate for the neighborhood. So it looked like the Colonials across the street. Those were the most positive. feedback we got on that development.
I agree totally, Laura. You're right.
Is there a takeaway from that? Because I recall the rendering of that development, so I got a sense of what they were proposing. And I remember that, Laura, in terms of what they were talking about. But it seems to me that there's something about that location that we would say that's appropriate, but other locations in town might not be. So if we're thinking about residential districts, is it possible that it could be in one residential district versus another, or on a major street, or in the TOD area? Or are there other concepts that we could suggest or explore?
You're essentially asking, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Beth.
You're essentially asking whether there are areas where we would want to loosen up rules to allow people to turn their houses into duplexes, triplexes, and other forms of multifamily housing. And wherever you do that, I think is going to have, if it's in a single family neighborhood, it's going to have, I mean, Harold thinks it won't have any implications on the property values around it. I think it will. So I would be reluctant to say this neighborhood, you know, we're willing to do that in, and this other neighborhood we aren't.
So
there are examples in Portland and Seattle where they have done this that are actually quite amazing. There are examples in Asheville, North Carolina, where they have done this that are absolutely amazing. And
that's great. I mean, those are newer areas, and you know, we can all point to different parts of the country. There are thousands of municipalities in this country. I think, you know, you would need to do, I'm not willing to say one neighborhood we're going to allow this, in another neighborhood we aren't.
Glenn, I have a suggestion. I don't know if the group agrees to it. I would just make them as of right in some of those zones that are permitted as special case under current situation in LB, LBB, CA, CF district. These are all located near the town center, and they're also part of the TOD zone, which allows for density. And assisted living facilities need transportation and need good connectivity to support services. So these are the districts that are closer to those things. So why do we have to go through a special case if we have defined regulations?
So let me go back. You're talking about the age restricted, is that correct, Susmitha?
Yes.
Okay. So let me go back, and I've got some work to do on this one. I've made note of our conversation on this. I'm going to go back and look at the zoning map to figure out, as Susmitha points out, exactly which zones these are. And it's quite possible that these may not be the residential districts that we think that they are. They may be a little bit more diverse or have some more character to them. And this may have some other areas of possibility. So let me do some more research on this, following up on what Harold brought up, and we can talk about it again in the future. Does that sound fair?
Well, yes. I just want to be clear what we are talking about, because assisted living was mentioned. That's a very different thing. But we're talking about allowing people to turn their homes into duplexes and multifamily houses, loosening that up.
Well, I think.
No, I'm talking about 1.2.2 that we were discussing.
Right, but Harold brought up the possibility, he brought up a different issue. So I just want to be clear what we're talking about.
I was not following up with Harold's comment. I was just responding on my side. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you then, Smita.
All right, so Harold, I will continue to follow up on your thought and put some additional thought into that as well. So if I understand correctly, then on 1.2.1.2, we're talking about, I think as Beth had raised originally, allowing some more flexibility for age-restricted housing options. It doesn't have to be 20 acres. It doesn't have to be detached units. but it could allow for a lot of different types of opportunities, including redevelopment of an existing school, provided it was age restricted. So there may not be a housing minimum. There may not be a housing maximum. It might be a special case. We're going to look at and decide what we think sort of fits in that situation. Is that fair, that we're prepared to recommend looking at options and more flexibility here for age restricted housing?
Yes. And I
Yes.
specifically was saying, if you took my lot that has 1,700 square foot build on it
Yep.
and split that in half, you could put two dwellings by simply manipulating the side yard footages and the
Yep.
front yard footages. And you could fit two dwellings on this same space that would accommodate, and particularly if you do it as senior housing.
Okay.
And if we specifically targeted some of our properties that are mortgage foreclosures or tax liens that we end up buying, would
Yep.
be a good demonstration project. ARP just gave a $1 million plus grant for a town to try that as an option.
And Glenn, this is Desmond. I think a town like Stratford offers a lot of opportunity for those kind of projects. If we want to take up something like what Harold just mentioned, I'm in construction, and a lot of Stratford isn't developed, but a lot of the land is allocated out. And there's a lot of pockets where you can do something like what Harold's saying here, just to get more properties without necessarily losing character in the neighborhood.
Yep. So I think I have a little bit more homework to do to follow up on this. So I will take care of that. Other thoughts here on either residence apartment regulations, affordable housing, or TOD overlay? How do people feel the TOD overlay is working?
I think it's working great.
I think it's worked very well over the years that we've had it. I do suspect we've pretty much, my own opinion here is I think we've kind of maxed out, or we're close to maxing out on what the neighborhood there is capable of handling, accepting. So I think that's something we need to just take a look at. We've done what, 3 or 4 properties under that right now, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, there are some limitations in that area around the train station as far as traffic flow and certain other items in there. So it probably is due for a look over at some point.
So Chris, if I played the 3 bears with you, which is leave it as is, rein it in a little bit, or amp it up a little bit, what do you think is the overall thought process from your perspective in terms of the TOD regulation?
I'd probably be more inclined to say rein it in a little bit. We're probably at least 10 years into this. I'm trying to remember exactly what year it was that it was passed. And we went from having, nothing to, and I'm counting 1111, at least one on Ferry Boulevard. I'm not sure if the other one came in. I'm trying to think. I think one of them came in at 8:30 as opposed to TOD, and then the one that was just passed over across from Christ Church. So just taking into account some of the public feedback that we got about it, and I think being in an uncertain time right now where train ridership has actually dropped off completely, we may be seeing a realignment in the way people live and work. But although I do acknowledge that the TOD concept is huge up and down the rail corridors of the tri-state area. You just need to hop on a train and take a ride one day, and you will see it all over the place. So, I think it probably needs maybe just a review and maybe even a slight tightening up on it.
Glenn, just to add, I think there is market interest in TOD because there are a couple of developers, realtors who keep calling, asking about few properties either at the edge of TOD boundary or within the boundary, how many units they can accommodate and what's the parking required are the questions we keep getting.
Yep.
So there is an appetite from the real estate community, and maybe there is market demand, I don't know. But in response to what Chris Levy has been mentioning, maybe our complete streets that will be implemented on Main Street could help, I don't know, in alleviating some of those auto trips that are generated inside the town by residents for, you know, reaching the support services or the train station.
Yep.
But, you know, it's worth looking into and see on the demand side how things are and on the other side of the spectrum how residents are perceiving it.
So it's Laura. This is an interesting time for us, and COVID in this instance has aligned perfectly for us to reassess and to maybe even reset. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but with the lack of activity on Metro North right now and the infrastructure improvements on exit 32 and 33, I think we're going to have a great opportunity to see how much of that stress is relieved, how much we can expand complete streets and have this whole concept of village concept, air quotes I'm saying, you guys, of village living, pedestrian access, vibrant community, affordable housing. And I don't mean 830G, I just mean housing that is affordable, that so you can take your extra income and actually do things and that will stimulate the economy. So I'm all with you, Chris. I think we just need to hold on right now for TOD. I think just like any developer, you're going to go where you think you can make the money, and that's why they want to expand TOD, because there's just on the outskirts, there's some property that they've been able to package, and they can make some money on it. And I'm all for making money. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not squashing this. I just want developers to make money where we have a need, and
Yep.
we haven't defined the need.
I think, Laura, go ahead, Beth.
I just want to point out where I'm working in the city, they have no plans whatsoever anytime in the future to go above 40% capacity. And that means, I think what that means is I used to be an outlier in terms of living in terms of my commute. I think there are going to be more people who are willing to go in, who are willing to travel longer distances. They won't have the requirement that they need to live close to the train station. They're willing to have a 2-hour or 2.5-hour commute each way, as long as it's not every day. So I think COVID is going to shake up things. It's going to allow for much more telecommuting, and it's also going to. I think Stratford will benefit from it because you're going to see people who are willing to live not close to the train station and still do long commutes, as long as it's not daily.
And to your point about telecommunicating, I'm sorry, Glenn, I just wanted to throw in the technology piece. Whatever we do, we have to have strong infrastructure, whether it's utility corridors, technology, telephone, telecommunication. That's just the last point. Thank you.
Guys, we're roughly at our quitting time, so I'm going to turn it back here to Chris in a moment. I do find these conversations very helpful. It's funny because we're coming at a particular topic, which is really the best future development for Stratford through the lens of housing only. And I think as our conversations go, you're really helping me come up with concepts and strategies about how to tie all of this together and make it a meaningful document for you. So I just want you to know that I'm finding these conversations helpful, and I think we're going to end up with a great plan as a result. So I think we have a meeting, I think, set up for next week. So I think if this is a good break time, Chris, I'll turn it back to you.
Yes, I know I have a hard stop. I'm sure a few other folks have.
I have a hard stop right now. I'm actually late, so I'm
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn by Beth Stefani. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Harold Watson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank everybody.
Opposed, no.
Okay, everybody, see
Carries
you next week.
unanimously. Have a nice Labor Day, everyone, and we'll talk next week.
Ciao.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Be well.